The news is pretty miserable at the moment. There's the war in Ukraine, floods in Pakistan, and droughts across both Europe and China. However, by far and away the most lethal crisis this year has been the ongoing civil war in Ethiopia, which has so far claimed an estimated 500,000 lives through a combination of interethnic violence and state-induced famine. In March, federal forces finally agreed to a ceasefire with the Tigrayan Defense Forces, the main belligerent on the rebel side. But unfortunately for Ethiopians, and especially those in Tigray, in late August, that ceasefire collapsed. So in this video, we're going to be taking a look at recent developments in Tigray, how the instability has since spread to other parts of the country, and whether this is the beginning of the end for Ethiopia as a unified state. Before we get into it, we should say we've done a fair few videos on this topic in the past. So if you want to know more about the history of the conflict, then go and check out some of those. If you don't have time, the TLDR is that since late 2020, federal forces have been waging a war against the Tigrayan Defense Forces, who are associated with the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front. The TPLF ruled Ethiopia from 1991 until 2018, when they were ousted by the incumbent Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. Now, Ahmed and the TPLF don't really get along, both because Abiy allegedly wanted to centralize power, which would have left the TPLF with less power at the regional level in Tigray, and because Abiy pursued closer relations with Eritrea and its totalitarian president, Isaias Afwerki. Now, the TPLF don't really like Afwerki because they fought a civil war against him in the late 90s, and there have been basically constant border clashes on the Eritrea-Tigray border ever since. Anyway, back to the current conflict between the Ethiopian Federal Forces and the Tigrayan Defense Forces. Now, while the TPLF originally had the upper hand, making steady progress south towards the capital, in late 2021, Abiy started buying arms from at least 4 countries, and promptly overwhelmed the TPLF. In March 2022, with the TPLF retreating, the two sides agreed to a ceasefire. But unfortunately for everyone, in late August this ceasefire collapsed, and fighting between the two sides restarted. Now, this wasn't too much of a surprise. The war crimes committed by both sides have crippled relations, and Abiy and the TDF have been stuck in a sequencing stalemate, with the TDF demanding that Abiy resumes aid shipments to Tigray before they fully withdraw, and Abiy demanding that they withdraw before any resumption of aid shipments. For context, for the past 18 months or so, humanitarian aid hasn't been reaching Tigray, which has only exacerbated widespread famine in the region. Now, those in Tigray claim that Abiy is withholding food and aid in order to pressure the TPLF into a surrender, while Abiy has predictably denied this, instead blaming the TPLF. But the evidence at this point does suggest that federal forces have been actively preventing aid from reaching Tigray. And that's especially an issue because Tigray was already suffering through a long-running drought which has buffeted the Horn of Africa for the past 4 years, putting 22 million people in Kenya, Somalia, and Ethiopia at risk of starvation, according to the UN. Rising food prices in the last couple of years have exacerbated this crisis, which is why the majority of people in Tigray were already in a state of food insecurity before the war even began. As a consequence, nearly 40% of the region's 6 million inhabitants now face an extreme lack of food. Researchers from Belgium's Ghent University estimate that as many as 200,000 people have already died in the famine, on top of a further 100,000 deaths from a lack of healthcare, and an estimated 100 people who are dying of starvation every single day. Worryingly then, aid shipments are still struggling to get into Tigray, and if fighting restarts, the catastrophic famine will almost definitely continue. More worrying still, the civil war has apparently destabilized the rest of the country. Now, this is largely because both sides have appropriated local ethnic militias to help their cause. The TPLF, for example, have joined forces with 8 other anti-Abiy groups to form the Tigrayan Defense Forces, while Abiy's forces have formed an implicit alliance with the Eritrean forces and the northern and ethnic Amhara militias known as the Fano in central Ethiopia. Now, obviously putting all of these ethnic militias on a war footing hasn't been good for inter-ethnic tensions in Ethiopia, and there's been renewed violence in Oromia, the country's largest region and home to the Oromo people, which represents about 34% of Ethiopia's population. While Abiy himself is an Oromo descendant, his government's de facto alliance with the Fano has deeply upset the Oromo, not least because the Fano have been accused of various atrocities against the Oromo. Consequently, the Oromo Liberation Army, the largest Oromo ethnic militia, who have traditionally campaigned for Oromo independence, have in recent weeks staged a series of attacks against the Fano and federal forces. Worryingly, Ethiopian intelligence shows that the OLA is working with Al-Shabaab, a jihadist group linked to Al-Qaeda that usually operates in neighbouring Somalia. On top of this, there's been renewed fighting in the Al-Fashqa region, a disputed border territory between Ethiopia and Sudan. Again, this has been seen as a symptom of the recent empowerment and legitimization of these ethnic militias, which has created yet more instability in the country. So that all sounds like pretty bad news, but what happens next? Well, as things stand, there's a genuinely non-trivial chance of Ethiopia collapsing. Federal forces have proved incapable of beating the TPLF, which means they probably won't be able to handle the TPLF and the OLA, and possibly even Al-Shabaab at the same time. Inter-ethnic tensions are also rising, and with the international community less keen on intervention at the moment and preoccupied with the war in Ukraine, it's likely they won't receive the help they might expect. This is a tragic and terrifying fall from grace for a country that was only years ago seen as Africa's next economic powerhouse, with its leader in receipt of a Nobel Peace Prize. Well, I'll have to update you on what happens next as it plays out. But for now, it looks like things are getting worse in Ethiopia, and a complete collapse doesn't look entirely impossible. If that's not enough TLDR for you, then you can find more exclusive TLDR content only on Nebula.